My name is Maura Policelli. I'm the Executive Director of the Washington, D.C. office for the Keough School of Global Affairs, based at the University of Notre Dame. And we are thrilled to be hosting a fantastic policy conversation today. We have several people here in the room and many more of you online from around the world. So thank you for being with us in today's age of hybrid events. It's exciting to have some connections here together, and unfortunately you will not all be able to enjoy the wine and refreshments afterwards, but thank you for being with us virtually. I'm going to hand things over to my esteemed colleague, Professor Lisa Schirch. Lisa is a new member to, sorry, I apologize, I haven't been talking into the microphone. Lisa has been with the Keough School a couple of years now, and she's a fantastic addition as a practitioner and policy practitioner and experienced academic in the field of peace studies. A little bit, it would take too long to read her entire bio, but Lisa has 30 years of experience in peace building research, policy advocacy, practice, and teaching. She's a political scientist by training and earned her PhD at the George Mason University's Carter Center for Peace and Conflict Resolution. Her most recent book that we're here to discuss, along with her co-authors, is Social Media Impacts on Conflict and Democracy, the Techtonic Shift. And I'm thrilled to hand things over to Lisa and her co-authors.
Thank you so much, Maura, for hosting us. Thank you for those of you in the room who in this post-pandemic world are breathing air with other people. We are going to reward you with wine and cheese afterwards. So for those of you, there's 240 people signed on to this on Zoom. So those of you who are in the neighborhood should walk over at least afterwards so we can get to know you and exchange cards and information. So we'll be advancing the slides. You can put on the next slide, Carla. And let me just introduce my co-panelists first. We have Spandana Singh, Spandy, who is a technology policy researcher and advocate, specifically focusing on internet platforms, policies, practices, and use of AI, artificial intelligence, and machine learning to shape and curate our online experiences. Her work has been with the Esya Center as a policy analyst at the New America Open Technology Institute. She has worked with Twitter's public policy team and as a member of the World Economic Forum Expert Network. On my right is Iria Puyosa, who's a senior research fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Research Lab. She's leading a project on encrypted point-to-point messaging platforms. And she has worked with a number of universities, the Andres Bello Catholic University in Venezuela, Brown University, Central University of Venezuela, until she was forced to leave her tenured position and subsequently the country because of her critical work looking at the Venezuelan government. She is also a member of the Toda Peace Institute's International Research Advisory Council. As some of you know, I am a senior research fellow at the Toda Peace Institute, and they have a specific program on social media technology and peace building, where we do ongoing research in partnership with the University of Notre Dame. So with those introductions, let me dig right into just giving you a bit of a background on this book. So the Toda Peace Institute sponsored this research. We began actually after the 2016 elections, when a lot of attention was focusing on the US and in Europe and what was happening in the Northern and the Western hemisphere with social media impacts on democracy and conflict, but there was not as much emphasis on the Southern hemisphere. Next slide. So we argue in the book that there has been a tectonic shift, purposely spelled wrong, or spelled with the tech emphasizing that technology is dramatically shifting our elections, our democratic processes, the way groups are polarizing and in conflict with each other. Not that there wasn't polarization before social media, but that social media is an amplifier, is an accelerant for polarization. It's, as we see, there's widespread disinformation. We have digital authoritarianism that is escalating all the time with troll armies. We have mass radicalization happening not only in the United States, but in support of hateful agendas, discriminating against already marginalized groups in other countries as well. So in Sri Lanka, against the Muslim citizens, in Myanmar, in many other countries. And what this book really focuses on is looking for those multi-stakeholder approaches. So in the field of peace building, and if you follow the UN Department of Peace Building and Political Affairs, they're always like thinking there's not just one solution here. It's a multi-stakeholder solution that's complex. Next slide. Next slide. There we go. So I'm just showing you on the map here the countries highlighted that are covered in the book. So there's 13 case studies of each of these countries in red. So we really focused on the Southern Hemisphere. We invited local researchers to document their own contexts. What are they hearing? What are they seeing? What are the trends? Are they similar to what's happening in the North and in the Western Hemisphere? And what was so striking, and my students every year, we read this book and they notice this. Did you tell the researchers to come up with the same recommendations? And no, actually, we did not give guidance. That the problems in each of these countries is so similar. There are definitely unique cultural aspects, but the dynamics are very similar across contexts, and the solutions that local researchers identified were also very similar across contexts. So as an editor for the book, it wasn't me dictating what should be said, it was really emerging from these on-the-ground researchers. Next slide. So with that, I will pass it over to Sandy for, first of all, pass it over to Iria, first of all, for a presentation on the Venezuela case study in the book, and then we'll turn to Sandy.
Well, thank you for coming, and thank you for listening to people online. I will present some highlights from my brief on Venezuela, but I would like to connect what we're seeing in Venezuela with larger trends on digital authoritarianism, so kind of using the Venezuela case in order to illustrate what I'm seeing happening in other places in the world. So I saw it first in Venezuela, but I have seen similar problems, similar trends, similar patterns in other countries over the years, and it's what I want to kind of highlight in this presentation. You can pass the slide, please.
Next slide. There we
go. Okay, so this is the timeline how digital authoritarianism happened in Venezuela over the last 20 years. I think when the process started in 2014, and it was mostly lawfare. It was a series of regulations were enacted to control information in mass media, but also in internet. There was kind of nothing, all the social media, was the blogs, the online forums, they were started to be regulated right at the moment they were kind of in the first steps. Then we start to see around 2009, it was a move to control media becoming more stronger, and we start to see two parallel scenes. One, it was controlling the public speech on criticizing the government, and another one spreading government propaganda. So we started to have what at the moment was called patriot trolls. Those were trolls entering in social media, mostly commenting on blogs, online forums, and Twitter, kind of contradicting the people who were criticizing the government, harassing people. So that was kind of unique phenomenon to watch, because at the moment, 2009, there was nothing written about this. Nobody was reading about troll armies, but we were seeing them happening at the moment. And we start also to see a series of barriers to the internet access. Until the time, Venezuela was kind of early adopters for many technologies. It was kind of somewhat richer country. People loved technology, so people had the new gadget, the new phone. So it was kind of ahead on connectivity comparing to other Latin American countries. In 2009, that started to reverse. There was disinvestment. It was barriers for companies to do maintenance, to invest in technology for internet access, and the trend started to be backwards. Then 2010 it was a huge launch of the presidential operation on social media. So Hugo Chavez became a Twitter celebrity, and it became a whole organization of at the moment people used to call La Tropa, so the troops, the government troops. They were in charge of amplifying all the propaganda, government-sponsored propaganda. That's information operations from Venezuela affecting other Latin American countries start to happen very early, 2010, 2012, before anyone in the United States was looking at that. So, and then we started to see happening in other countries. It started to happen in Mexico, it started to happen in Nigeria, it started to happen in Ecuador, it started to happen in Spain, it started to happen in England, later in the United States. So all those government-sponsored propaganda, political motivated disinformation. It was kind of early for us, but it became commonplace and now it's everywhere. Then the other trend we start to see is the surveillance. We start to have a lot of capture of biometric data using finger capture machines for buying food or for buying medicines or for participating in elections. And that was increasing a national database. Nowadays, it's kind of most of the population is there. All of these surveillance mechanisms we started to see in Venezuela 2012 and even more consolidated as of 2016. We are seeing in other countries like India. Of course, China is only leading on that kind of technology. Actually, the development of Venezuela is a Chinese technology, but it started before worldwide. People were talking about, oh, this is happening, the social credit in China. We had something similar for several years. And then we had the most common thing people think about was censoring online discourse. Technical censorship came later. So all the other things, more sophisticated, more human technology interface came earlier, and the outright shutdowns of the internet or taking down content, taking down social media came later. But all these things we started to see very early, 2004, 2013 in Venezuela. Later, we started to see in other countries, and it was kind of shocking. Well, it's exactly the same. We started to say, well, it's a digital authoritarianism handbook, and everyone is going to copy. And in the case of Venezuela, it was a lefty government. We have seen right-wing governments using the same playbook, so it doesn't matter your ideology. It matters the vocation to become authoritarian and to control people's life. Next. One of the trends, important trends we are seeing is criminalization of online speech. I'm not going to go over all of that because it will take too much time. But one of the things I want to highlight there is the use of lawfare for criminalizing people. Particularly, we had an anti-hate legislation. We used to put in jail people who just criticize the government. Everything you say against the government is hate. So we have seen in other countries with anti-hate is not really about racial hate or ethnic hate or religious issues, what you feel understand it, but about curtailing opposition expression. Next. Information operations. This is kind of very big for Venezuela. It's one of the areas in which I have been developing. Most of my research have been government-sponsored, coordinated disinformation operations. Venezuela have been doing, as I told you, since 2010 in a very well-organized manner. So there are kind of mechanisms we have been installing on how the regime deploy the disinformation propaganda, affecting both national audience and audience in other countries in which Venezuelan regime had interest to affect, to influence. Next. This is probably the most critical part of the digital authoritarianism, the homeland system. I already mentioned it. Is a system in which all these citizens who want to have access to welfare need to register. So you, for getting medicines or getting subsidized books, more recently for getting subsidized gas, or even it was used even for tracking COVID-19 symptoms. So almost but by now, at the beginning, people just resisted, just they don't register, they go around with their lives, and only the people who were close to the government registered. But nowadays, most people living in Venezuela isn't there, because it's no other way to fill your car with gas or getting some medicine in case you had a catastrophic illness, like you had cancer or you had IHP. It's no other way to find the medicine for that, which you are not there. So people are there in a huge database in which most people in the country are registered. And when you register your whole family group. So one person in your home, in your house who had to register, it means everyone is in there. So, and that system is used for all the welfare. So it's very consequential in controlling people's behaviors. It's kind of something we keep seeing in other countries, some push to have that kind of systems, and it's really, really concerning. And for me, it's the crucial piece of any digital authoritarianism system. All the other things may be more visible, but this is the more serious one, in my view. Next. Going to recommendations, since I think it's important for continent digital authoritarianism. I say we saw it happen in Venezuela over 20 years. We are seeing happening in other countries around the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in Middle East, in Europe, but in other places it's starting to happen, and it's the moment to stop it before it is becoming too big to be taken down. One of these things I think I want to highlight is building trust, building partners with different stakeholders to find solutions. So one of the issues I keep finding when looking at issues of social media impact and political conflicts is people in civil society and people in platforms and people and policymakers and researchers are kind of from their own corner, and sometimes contradict each other. And I think it's important to make agreements and to kind of find solutions, even though you had a slightly different interest. It's more likely you will make an agreement to advance, to move forward solutions. Next. So as I say, this is a multi-stakeholder approach, and each of these groups has a role to play. We should get together to play that role in international organizations, journalists, platforms, digital rights activists, think tanks, research centers, policymakers. All of those have to be kind of in the same room, like we are here, trying to see what is the issues, what the solution we think, and what can we do from our expertise, our ability to make change, to influence change. Next. Here, I want to kind of highlight, my whole presentation has been about that, how this is a kind of transnational phenomenon. So my case study was Venezuela, but the digital authoritarianism is on the rise in worldwide in general, and these authoritarian digital dictators share practices, they learn from each other. They kind of are allies in the way they deploy their propaganda or the way they deploy their control systems. And democratic resilience should be also be that kind of partnership, that transnational partnership. So you can defend democracy here in the United States, while the rest of the Western Hemisphere is falling apart. So there is no other democratic country in the hemisphere, it's going to be hard. So I had to be working together, understanding these issues are transnational, and also understanding, for instance, platforms are transnational. So you can have solutions for any social media issue can affect only one country. You have to get something is global. It's going to affect all countries in the world who use social media. So we need to work together, and that understanding that it's not a specific country who had an issue. It's the world and the democracy in general who had an issue. So one thing I always try to alert is to try to find solutions who take in consideration the real conflicts, social and political conflicts existing in the places, but also trying to avoid creating another harms, another problems what you are pushing for a solution. All the issues, we were last week in a conference, we were discussing issues of trust of safety, and everyone is looking at the issue from their viewpoint and trying to solve this particular aspect. And when you try to solve this particular aspect, we had looked into the overall situation. You maybe are creating two or three more new problems. And when we get together and see, okay, your issue is worthy to be taken care of, but there is another one and this is another one. How do we make this work together? For me, this is kind of the only way forward to get to solve the new set of problems we are facing. Next. So things very specific about kind of working together with platforms, for me that is very important. We can work with platforms using human rights assessment lens. We can use ethics is doing good. We can use conflict sensitivity to work together with platforms. I really think they are part of the solution. I keep hearing they are part of the problem. I'm not so sure about, but I'm completely sure they are part of the solution. There is no way to from civil society or for researchers to solve the social media problems if we don't partner with platforms. So I think this is important for us to kind of build trust and to bridge the different interests and the different goals we may have. Next, I think this is the last. Yeah, but basically, I think I have already said everything is there. That I think it's enough. I can close because we are getting long.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Iria. That was a fantastic overview of not only digital authoritarianism in Venezuela, but what we are now seeing other countries learning from Venezuela. Passing it to you, Sandy, to talk about India.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
Yes. Yeah, it would take too long.
Next slide.
Yeah,
Next slide.
Yeah, yes, those are part of mine.
No, sorry, keep going until we get to India. There we go. Oh, no.
Next one.
Next
That's my close. That's my close.
There we go.
Hi everyone, my name is Spandana Singh, and I'm going to be talking to you about the book chapter that I wrote, which is focused on the false information ecosystem in India.
Make sure your
just-
mic's on.
yeah.
There is a chat, somebody in the chat was asking to close that global webinar.
Yes.
I think actually I will try to do it from this.
Can you do that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I can do it from this one.
Yeah,
Can I?
yes. You're the fierce.
Is it from this one?
There. Here,
Let me move
this
it
one.
out. Okay, perfect.
So techno.
So since we wrote this book chapter, a lot of my work has focused on looking at how internet platforms specifically can also improve their efforts to tackle online misinformation and
Yeah,
disinformation.
speak louder, we're having a hard time hearing you, so.
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
Yeah,
there.
okay.
Move it
Pull
closer.
to you, yeah.
So since we wrote this book chapter, a lot of my work has focused on looking at how internet platforms can specifically tackle online disinfo and how they can continue to do so in the future. So I'm going to also talk through some of those recommendations. So this image is from a video depicting a child being kidnapped by two helmeted men on a motorcycle. And this went viral on WhatsApp in India in 2018. And it sparked fears that child kidnappers were running amok in Indian cities. And as a result, mob violence began. And that killed, I think, 33 people, and it injured more than 99 in various separate attacks. And so this, I think, is a really good case study of how misinformation and disinformation started to spread in India and the kind of offline impact that it was having before, many countries of the world really had grasped that misinformation and disinformation were a real problem. Next slide, please. So why India? Online misinformation and disinformation have become fairly common, especially in the last 3 or 4 years in many countries. But I think when it comes to India, there are a number of converging factors that make it a particularly salient place for online mis and disinfo to spread. And I'm just going to talk through some of those factors. Next slide, please. So the first is internet access and adoption have grown rapidly in India. So if you look at the slide, you can see in 2007, the internet penetration rate was only 4%. And in 2021, this had risen to 47%. So that meant that during this period, a really large number of new users came online. And this was due to availability of cheap phones and cheap data plans. And India is the second largest country in the world. So 47% of a population of 1.3 billion people is a lot of people to come online. Next slide, please. Second, India is one of the largest online markets for many major internet platforms. So for Facebook, WhatsApp, and YouTube, India is the largest market in the world, and it's the third largest market for Twitter. And for comparison, India has 239 million Facebook users. The second largest market is the United States, with a little over 179 million users. So Indian user base really comprises a vast majority of social media users online. And access to the internet and these platforms have allowed the average Indian to create, share, and consume multimedia content with greater affordability and ease. And at the same time, there's also been a steady decline in trust in media institutions in the past few years. So more and more Indians have started turning to social media as well as their offline circles in order to access reliable information. Next slide, please. But at the same time, although there's been greater access and adoption of internet and social media platforms, digital and media literacy in India has not risen at the same rates. And so this means that the average user can actually be complicit in spreading misinformation because they're not able to determine what's true and false. It also means that bad actors can easily take advantage of the average Indian user to spread misinformation and disinformation. Next slide, please. Then just lastly, and I think this is probably one of the most important challenges, India is not a monolithic country. There are 19,500 languages and dialects in India that are spoken as a mother tongue. There are more than 2,000 ethnic groups, and there are 7 major religious groups. So when we think about fact-checking, for example, what kind of scale and what kind of resources do you need to fact-check content across all of those languages and to have expertise in all of these cultural issues? And India has a very long history of social and communal issues that have really been able to be exploited by disinformation campaigns. And I think that this is probably one of the factors that makes combating this and disinfo from any sort of stakeholder perspective very challenging in India. Next slide. So where are we today? That case study I showed you in the beginning was from 2018. I think misinformation and disinformation in India has gotten even worse, to be honest. A study conducted by the University of Alberta found that during the course of the pandemic, 1 in 6 pieces of fake information on COVID-19 came from India. And it was the largest sort of producer of misinformation on the pandemic. So India is coming online. There's a big use of social media, but as demonstrated by this figure, the ability to discern true from false has not kept up. Next slide, please. So as Lisa and Iria talked about, I think it's really critical to have a multi-stakeholder approach when we talk about combating these kinds of issues, but it's also important to recognize that the ability of each of these stakeholder groups will vary from country to country. So in India, for example, because we don't have strong media and digital literacy, I don't think users are going to be the first line of defense necessarily, and that's an area where the other stakeholders need to invest in building capacity. Next slide, please. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research I've done over the last 3 years, which is focused on how internet platforms can improve their efforts to combat mis and disinfo. I'm going to contextualize this as much as possible in the Indian market, but recognizing that most internet platforms operate with like a global sort of nature. So what they do in one country really should be expanded and tested in other markets. So the 4 major areas that I think there needs to be a key focus is access to reliable information, strong content policies, content curation, which is an umbrella term I use to talk about how platforms use artificial intelligence and machine learning to curate the content we see online, and then transparency. Next slide, please. So in terms of fact checking, as I mentioned, India is not a monolithic country, so fact checking is really challenging. But I think fact checking really forms the cornerstone of many platform efforts to combat mis and disinfo, because many platforms partner with external, reliable, trusted institutions to do this fact checking, and that's a way to ensure that their processes the fact checking is done well. In India, however, many of the key fact checking partners are very small and they lack resources, and so we hear from many of them that the daily number. Can you hear me? The number of tips that they receive per day, like they're not able to cope with it. And the lack of scale and the lack of funding means that they're only able to fact check content in a handful of languages or in a handful of regions. And that means that some of the most vulnerable communities in India are going to be left vulnerable to the threat. Second, many platforms have formed partnerships over the last few years. We've seen this in the US a lot, especially around elections, like partnering with state election bodies. When COVID started, we saw many platforms partner with the WHO to obtain access to reliable information. I think that's a really critical way as well of obtaining access to reliable information. The biggest challenge, I think, across markets is that what is a legitimate and reliable institution? Who do users trust to give them information? As a result, who should platforms trust? And the third is user literacy. So I think this is an area where platforms can have a really profound impact in India. Companies like Google, WhatsApp, Facebook, they all have hosted some user literacy workshops, but they haven't been scalable. And I think that if I had to sort of select one thing to really focus on in the Indian market, it would be investing a lot more resources to figure out which design works, which is the most effective, and then scaling it with the support of the other stakeholders in the tech policy ecosystem. Next slide, please. So the next area I want to talk about is content policy. I think content policy is really a foundational thing that all platforms should be doing at this point. It's 2022. But if you look at how platforms were combating mis and disinfo 5 years ago, many of them didn't even have concrete policies outlining mis and disinfo. They had policies on hate speech, graphic violence, impersonation, and then when there was something that was misleading, they would say, well, it falls under one of these. But that wasn't clear enough, and that allowed a lot of harmful content to slip through the cracks. And we've seen a lot of positive changes. Most platforms today now have clear mis and disinfo policies, but I think it's really important that they're consistently enforced. And I think that when platforms are developing these policies, they need to consult with stakeholders, and they can't just be the stakeholders sitting in DC. It has to be the stakeholders working on the ground in India, in Venezuela, in different countries, so that they understand how misinformation and disinformation is spreading in different regions, in different countries, in different communities, and make sure that their policies are adaptable and keeping up with these changing narratives. Next slide, please. And then there's algorithms and friction. So this, I think, is sort of an emerging area, and I'll talk about this on the next slide. It's really challenging to understand what the best way forward is in this space, because platforms don't provide a lot of transparency, but I will ramble on about that in the next slide. No, please go back. So I think most people don't realize that, or the average user, let me say that, the average user doesn't realize that the content that they see on these social media platforms is highly curated and it's highly curated by algorithms. And these, I think platforms have introduced some mechanisms to combat misleading information by trying to intervene in the algorithmic curation process and introduce friction. So for example, Facebook downranks content on the newsfeed that's been debunked. It also downranks content that they think might be misleading but hasn't been fact-checked yet, as a way of sort of reducing viewership or circulation of that content. Twitter intervenes in some content recommendations on the service so that they're not promoting misleading content. And then many platforms have also started using labels, like on Twitter, before you retweet an article, it'll ask you, have you read this? Are you sure you want to share it? That's a good way of introducing friction in the information flow. But I think that when we talk about amplification of harmful content, I think amplification is a really loaded word that hasn't been clearly defined yet, and that's like a huge other tangent I can go on. But I think it's really important to think about how are these algorithmic tools driving and sort of exacerbating many of the misleading narratives we see online, and how much do we not know about how they work, and how much do we need to know in order to identify what the touch points are and what needs to change in order to sort of stymie the spread of misleading information. And next slide. And just to close out transparency, I always joke with my colleagues that I just tattoo transparency on my forehead because I talk about this everywhere I go. But if platforms are not transparent, we cannot hold them accountable. And we cannot know whether what they're doing works, and we cannot know how to change it as a result. And so I think we need to have a lot more transparency from platforms around how their policies are shaped, who they consulted, how they shaped it, how consistently they're being enforced, and what the impact of this has been on online disinfo. We need to know more about what are the actual methods that platforms are using to tackle misleading information, and then we need to know, well, what actually worked? And we've seen in the US election cycle, we've seen some platforms release information about, we changed our label design, so we increased engagement with the labels by X%. That's a good start, but I think we need to have a lot more information if we're trying to have a strong impact in this space. And there are many ongoing conversations around what meaningful transparency looks like. Who should get this data? Should we just be putting it on, a tech company website, or should it be vetted researchers? And I think that this needs to be a really big area of focus for folks in the multi-stakeholder ecosystem, because if we can't clearly take advantage of this moment and the sort of impetus there is around transparency right now, it's going to be a really lost cause.
Thank you so much to both of you for your very detailed and important analyses. I have just a few more slides, if you can forward to the next. So really what was evident across these themes is a term that we often think of just between groups, polarization, but there's a whole other field of study right now looking at what does polarization really mean and what are the elements of it. And I highlight three elements. That is, there's sort of individuals feeling isolated and disempowered. They don't have agency to affect their lives. So a lot of what social media is doing is fragmenting society. There's also this sort of intergroup horizontal cohesion element of people feeling excluded and marginalized. And then there is the state-society relationship. And do people feel part of the public sphere? Do they trust institutions? And this is where democratic elections comes in. So if we think of polarization a bit larger than we normally do, and we think of it as the individual, horizontal, and vertical elements, what we are trying to imagine is a digital sphere, next slide, that is focused on social cohesion, which is a term now used widely at the United Nations and more broadly. Peace building is how you get to social cohesion, but what social cohesion is sort of this ability for a society to solve problems without resorting to violence. And they do that by supporting individual agency, so people feel committed to a political process where they can engage in their life to affect decisions. There's trust building or horizontal cohesion between groups, and then there's efforts to have more transparency for public institutions, for government, so that the people can hold them accountable, and the state-society, contract, the social contract is working on both sides of the spectrum. So next slide, I just want to give a couple of these sort of multi-stakeholder recommendations that came out when we brought together all of the researchers for the chapters in this book for a workshop to try to figure out what is a coherent set of policy recommendations. So next slide. I'll just briefly go through these. You know, there's sort of a lot of discussion around the world on government regulations. Part of the real challenge here is many of these big tech companies are in the United States, but as you can see, they're impacting countries all over the world. Americans and American policymakers have a tremendous amount of responsibility at this point for regulating because these companies are here on our territory. There's all kinds of conversations happening. So we discussed, you know, requiring companies to buy insurance when there's a genocide, when there's violence as in India. Who's going to pay damages for the things that spread on social media? Should tech companies have to hold a license to, you know, again, hold them to account? Is there going to be a special tax for the way this kind of disinformation is undermining society? Risk audits. So for each location, Facebook wants to open a new office and start marketing in Cambodia or various countries around the world. What is their responsibility for thinking about what are the divisions in the society that already exist? How might this platform be weaponized by local people so that we can anticipate some of this? Holding tech companies responsible for that harmful content. Most of the focus in Europe and the United States is on this part of content moderation and moderation standards. Algorithmic transparency. So how is Facebook, YouTube, how are each of these companies curating the information that we each see, and why is that not transparent, and why don't we have more control, and really, why don't governments and security officials, you know, and this is dangerous because it can lead to digital authoritarianism too, but it's sort of what is the review process? Is it just corporate decisions alone that are going to decide our information highway and what's released and what's not, or how do we regulate that space? Next slide. There's a variety of recommendations from tech companies, from redesigning those algorithms. The next two I want to spend a little bit more time on in just terms of thinking about designing platforms for pro-social content, for social cohesion, recognizing that these new digital platforms are having a profound tectonic impact on our world, and they have a public responsibility for shaping that in a way that is going to do more good than harm. And I'm not sure the balance sheet is in the favor of social good at this point. Invest more in fact-checking, content moderation, and improving the cross-platform moderation coordination. Next slide. In terms of legacy media, we started realizing sort of there's a very hybrid ecosystem of information. So the legacy media or offline media is also polarizing right now, and it has been for the last 10 to 20 years. So, you know, there's Fox News and MSNBC, and you can see
It's not news.
it's very polarized in terms of what's happening in legacy media, and really the sort of how are we going to protect professional journalism standards and really have more independent news that is fact-checked, so that we have a public sphere where citizens in all countries have information about their governments, about corporations, and are able to hold them to account. That might mean dropping paywalls on some of the most professional journalism so that people have access to free, valid information. Next slide. Finally, you know, the next slide, there we go. Within civil society, as always, we're a bit chaotic. There's lots of different civil society groups, lots of different recommendations. Some want more moderation, some want less moderation. We have work to do in order to come up and work together on some solid priorities for the policy recommendations, because there's a lot right now. We need to continue to map and monitor how this is affecting our world, amplifying local voices, and mobilizing digital social movements for protecting democracy and human rights around the world. Thank you. Let's open it up. We have had a range of questions come in online. We don't have a lot of time, so I want to first open it up here in this circle to privilege the people who came out to drink wine and have cheese with us. What do you have questions for? Yes.
What about,
Yeah, can you say?
I'm not sure I get what you're saying, but think about propaganda and Cold War and all that stuff, like, World War II, whatever. It's been going on forever. So why not buyer beware? If you're gonna go buy a used car, beware, it could be a piece of junk. Why can't people just be responsible to know half of what you read is garbage? Because you have the freedom to say garbage. I could say, I'm the president, I'm not. So can't, why waste your time on all this? It's kind of like,
So social media is distinct from legacy media because in legacy media, the public was protected from some level of disinformation because the editors of that news could be sued. The distinction with social media is they cannot be sued. They are not held accountable for false information, and which is why we have such a huge escalation in false, deceptive, and hateful information online in the public sphere in a way that we didn't before social media. So yes, it existed before, but we have a new level of it. And yes, buyer beware, there is a lot of individual responsibility, but where is the responsibility of society to prepare people that most of what you see online might be false? And this is where the recommendations for digital media literacy, for teaching this at all levels, which some countries are doing already. Finland has integrated digital media literacy into, I think, every school level so that they are preparing their citizens. Basically, it's an immunization against conspiracies, against disinformation. And they're gonna have a better society for that investment.
If I could just jump in there, I think we in the US tend to view speech through the lens of the First Amendment and free speech.
I can't hear you.
In the US, we view speech through the lens of the First Amendment. It doesn't exist in other countries. Neither does buyer beware in every single country. And other countries have a desire for different standards of speech and different standards of accountability. And already tech companies sort of impose this First Amendment view on most companies. I think a lot of the recommendations and global South engagement of civil society is a pushback on that these issues are born on American platforms, and they're impacting billions of users around the world, and not everybody wants to live in that American lens because it doesn't play out in the same way in every country.
Yes.
Yes, thank you so much for the presentation. It's very informative, very interesting. My question is with respect to the term accountability, and sometimes me also using social media, like for my own personal usage, sometimes there are opportunities to report content. I'm interested to know what is the data behind those that see things, they report it. Sometimes people just have enough with certain platforms, and so they deactivate the accounts, and then there's those questions, why did you deactivate? Is it other, or is it this? There's many different reasons why people do that, and I'm interested to know who is looking at that data, is that data being used, is it being discussed by policymakers? Thank you.
Yes, I guess I will take that. Yeah, every platform handle these kind of issues differently, but most of the biggest social media platform had some mechanism for users to report what is considered harmful usage or content who break policy. So most of the platform had that embedded. People use a fair amount. What I've noticed, people tend to use more for spam or for hate speak directly to them. So when they are subject to aggression, people tend to use those reporting mechanisms. is less common and it's harder for people to use what larger issues. So it's harder for people to report to a platform, oh, hey, this is a huge disinformation operation run by a political party in my country. That is way harder. So for that, had to be different mechanisms. Some of the biggest platforms like Meta for Facebook especially, but also for Instagram and Twitter. YouTube is a little bit behind, but they have something to do research for vetting researchers to try to understand how this information is spreading on those platforms. So there are user reporting, and there are more monitoring of the whole platform behavior. Most of this data is kind of hard to get for researchers outside the platforms, and some people say even inside the platform is harder to get to quantify exactly how many infractions they are finding, because the data is kind of scattered in different buckets and different files. But there's an understanding on this is needed, and I think there's a movement forward for platforms to get better on their process, and for researchers to get access to this kind of information. But as Spandana said in the presentation, we're kind of still in the early stage of, okay, now we understand we need to do this. How to do it is still in the process, but I think we are kind of going into the right direction and working on this.
Thank you.
Yeah, hey, thank you very much for the panelists today, the presentations, very, very informative. And I think just in the short amount of time we've been here, you've already underscored the importance of having such events in our society as well as around the world. It just one sort of question, I think this probably goes more to Spandy, but I think anybody can on the panel can address this. This goes to the transparency discussion on AI. And I say this just from my own background, recently worked for a space satellite company that did AI on computer vision algorithms to determine something on the ground, object detection. And I know the same thing applies to big data sets as well. But one of the things that we'd always talked about, or at least our customers, was always important was what they call responsible AI. And that was sort of the subsets of that were explainable AI, reliable AI, and that's ethical, meaning, they can explain why it comes up with what it does, and then it does it with a high fidelity 90% of the time. And then it's ethical, it doesn't violate privacy rules or issues and things like that. I'm just curious if that analogy that I just presented sort of has the same properties here, when we're talking about big data sets and social media, and how might that apply?
Thanks. Yeah, Duck, I think as high-level principles they apply. I think the field of algorithmic transparency is definitely an emerging one. And one of the biggest challenges is I think that we have these policy ideals. We want social media platforms to do good, to promote social well-being. But how do you translate these policy values into technical components that can be incorporated into products? So you want a platform to give users agency. You want platforms to a recommender algorithm to make users happy. What does that mean when you implement it technically? And I think as we think about regulation in this space, that's also one of the biggest gaps is how are you taking what policymakers think platforms algorithms should be doing and making it explainable in the reverse way, making it explainable for engineers who then need to go and create metrics and measurable things that ensure that these tools are doing that at scale. Thank you. Are there more questions online? Yes.
Yeah, thank you all so much for the presentation. I have a question, I think, as Spandana, maybe this goes to you, but others as well, feel free to weigh in. Kind of these kind of recommendations you put forward, particularly related to the kind of consistent enforcement and, scalability and, consulting stakeholders when it comes to, tech platforms and their role. I'm curious what you think of the approach that, Meta has taken so far with the oversight board, and if you see this as something that's, a good start and, needs to be scaled up, and you'd like to see other companies emulate, or if there are, any, issues there or issues you think with that approach when it comes to either how they involve stakeholders or how, transparent they are and how consistent they are with their decisions.
Sure, absolutely. Did a lot of work on the oversight board in the past years. I think the oversight board is an experiment, and I think that that's what it will continue to be until we receive any sort of concrete data that demonstrates its impact.
the board is a new way of thinking about content moderation appeals, and I welcome that. But its impact is very limited. It reviews a handful of cases every year. It doesn't make binding policy change on Meta. Meta can choose to accept policy recommendations or not. So I think that that's the way I think of it. It's an experiment. I welcome other types of experiments as a way of, increasing access to appeals and increasing user agency. But I don't think the oversight board has had like a major change on how platforms moderate content. So I wouldn't, be the first person to say every company should start doing this or government should require companies to do that. I think that we need a lot more data in order to make that a reality.
Just a couple of key points. I think there's two aspects to this: is the intentional disinformation, misinformation, and then there's the unintentional, the bystander, the person who doesn't know who's passing it. So you got to come up with rules and regulations to battle both, and they're different. Two, next point is, it seems like we've kind of lost the battle in the social media space. We're reacting right now. We're behind the curve significantly. Therefore, digital literacy seems to be the primary piece we have to go after, because we got to educate folks now to both stop and then to prevent them being the unintentional, being able to identify. That requires personal engagement, not online engagement. And I know a lot of information organizations want to do this online, and I don't see how you change a person's bias, perception, or prejudice by trying to talk to them online. But when I look you in the eye and talk to you, I'm forcing you to confront your prejudice, your bias. That's when I will get you to change. That's when I will get to touch you and get you to change. Or you realize, I can't say that dehumanizing, devaluing piece to somebody in a way that I would online. I can't say that to you in person. To change that engagement or to change that bias. So those are things I think we really need to focus on and touching. And going back to your point of buyer beware, we can't be buyer beware until, as we said, we have the digital literacy. Once we have digital literacy, then we can talk about buyer beware. But there's always going to be somebody who's intentionally going to try to manipulate how you think and how you act.
One more question from the audience.
Yes. So also just to build on that, I was curious in terms of when social media was first used to explain democratization, it was like the Twitter revolution was very positive, a way to communicate. And now we're talking more about polarization. So I'm just noticing how, as a tool, was shifted in terms of our understanding over time. And I'm curious to also see about how we navigate the various dilemmas about dissidents trying to communicate when an authoritarian government might want to have social cohesion. It's like in Venezuela or so, versus in other kind of fragile democracies or even consolidated democracies where we're trying to monitor hate speech and try to. The other part is kind of the motivations. Like the big like social media companies have profit motivations. Their algorithms are being built to get more eyeballs, outrage, tracks. So there is similarly with the dilemma with the legacy media. If we make some of them more public, not behind paywalls, their profit model is also going to be hit. So it's kind of where do we square the circle in this situation? I'm puzzled. I don't know the answer myself. Thank you.
Yeah, I guess I will take it. We are here. We will focus on the use of social media for harmful content and digital authoritarianism, but still that other part is still there. And it wasn't one of my slides. I didn't talk about that because the time is short. But still nowadays, social media is a very important tool. Is crucial for organizing social movements. Is crucial for giving voice to marginalized communities. Is crucial for having a more open exchange of ideas from people coming from different parts of life. So that positive impact of social media is there too. It's not only the negative. We are kind of focusing on the negative in this conversation because we want to fix what is not working. But in fixing what is not working, we never should lose sight of all the positive impact social media bring to us. And it's particularly in authoritarian countries, social media is the only way for information to circulate. There is no television or news, printed news in Venezuela or many other authoritarian countries. It's not in Cuba, it's not in Russia. So the only way people get news and have the ability to question their governments and have the ability to get together and organize is through social media. So getting rid of social media is not an option. It's not what we need to do. So we need to foster that use, that positive use of social media, but by civil organizations, by social movements, by different kind of activists. And at the same time, we need to work on controlling, trying to handle the harms they are hitting. Getting to the points of the person right across me, there are a lot of experiments, still experimental, still a small scale, on how to drive civic pro-democracy conversations in social media, and most of them have been successful. There is a way to make people to reach consensus in social media discussion. Spandana mentioned the use of labels on some platforms that have been fruitful. There have been some indicators that is maybe a way to do. There are other organizations, civil society organizations, trying to model how to reach consensus. And one of the things also we know about from the studies of polarization and online polarization is people are more willing to hear what somebody from the other political view had to say online than person to person. Person to person, people avoid those conversations. I don't want to talk to my neighbor or to my relative about things we know we disagree, so we just avoid the issue. But in social media, I've been forced to listen the point of view of different person. And what we need to do is how we manage that conversation in order to keep it civil and to help people to move toward a space of no, I won't say agreement, but at least understanding the other people's point of view. And that is doable. That's something we can do.
I know we're over time, so I just want to make a final comment here. Our next research project at the University of Notre Dame and the Toda Pisas Institute is focused on the positive use of social media platforms for improving democracy and social cohesion. My colleagues from the Search for Common Ground are here. We're planning a big event in Silicon Valley in February in which we're going to be featuring and highlighting some of these platforms and the really transformational way they have enabled democratic decision-making to happen in Yemen and Libya and in Taiwan. So look forward to continuing the conversation with you. Thank you very much for attending in person. Thank you for those of you online. Please join us for some wine and cheese and juice.